Dragon's Dogma 2 is a beautiful title that may go down as one of the best looking games of the year. Capcom's open world epic features some outstanding lighting technology, with detailed RTGI giving the title a very refined appearance. But the game had substantial performance and visual faults, with broken image reconstruction on Xbox Series machines and framerate issues in dense city areas, in addition to other issues. That was true both for the game's launch version as well as its second patch, which we covered in a video shortly after launch. But just last week, Capcom debuted a new patch, Patch 7, which promises framerate uplifts and new visual toggles. So does this update cure Dragon's Dogma's ailments, or does the game still suffer from key technical flaws? Let's start by taking a look at Series X. In terms of basic visual settings, we're looking at a largely similar experience between Patch 2 and Patch 7. We still see the same beautiful RTGI presentation with ray tracing turned on, with a noticeably less striking appearance when RT is set to off. I couldn't really spot basic settings tweaks between the two patches, which is about what you'd expect. But thankfully, the reconstruction issues that plagued Series X have been resolved, sort of. Earlier versions of Dragon's Dogma 2 had really obtrusive checkerboarding artifacts on Series X, with the game presenting a pixelated and less detailed image than PS5. In Patch 7, these artifacts are much less noticeable, but the final resolve appears less crisp than PS5. I believe the game is checkerboarding to 4K on both consoles here. It's just not working right on Series X. The game features a new visual toggle as well, with players able to select high or low graphics quality. All this setting appears to do though is turn ray tracing and motion blur on or off. I suppose this could be helpful to some users, but I think it adds unnecessary complication and implies misleading things about the performance penalty that motion blur carries. The overwhelming majority of the performance difference between high and low is going to stem from ray tracing because toggling motion blur on and off on its own produces a very minimal frame rate impact. It's just not an especially demanding technique on current-gen console hardware. But performance has seen some tweaks. Now in general, the game performs identically to its Patch 2 iteration. I tested across a decent spread of game content, both with ray tracing on and off, and the game is a match or a near match throughout both patches. Expect a wobbly performance level by default, with the game without ray tracing scoring somewhat higher performance than the game with RT. In common with a few other RE Engine games, the developers don't really seem to be aiming for a specific framerate target. The game just runs in a sort of no man's land between 30 and 60 FPS in typical play. Patch 2 did introduce an option for a 30 FPS cap, however. Unfortunately, it was broken at the time, with poor frame pacing. In Patch 7, the situation is unchanged, with the same frame time perturbations, obvious in typical play. The game definitely feels more consistent, but its occasional frame time wobbles give it an unsteady feel on a conventionally refreshed display. But the game does see some substantial performance uplifts when CPU bound in NPC dense areas. In the examples earlier, Dragon's Dogma 2 appeared to be primarily limited by the performance of the Series X's GPU. Vernworth, the game's central city area, is the exception and is CPU bound much of the time. If we do a run around the city, we get substantially elevated performance in the new patch. It's not a life-changing boost, but it is a noticeable one. I repeated this test several times and always saw a decent framerate uplift. Capcom highlighted some improvements here in their patch notes, so the bump isn't a surprise. Initially, I suspected that some tweaks to NPC density or pop-in might be responsible, but side-by-sides reveal ambiguous results. Sometimes pop-in seems worse on Patch 2, and sometimes on Patch 7, and crowd size likewise differs from moment to moment. There isn't a fixed distance where NPC draw occurs on either patch, so I think the results overall are similar enough for me to call this one a draw. The performance improvements must come from other optimisations. There is one last detail I should mention. The patch notes mention support for 120Hz output, but this is a bit ambiguous for Series X users, as Xbox Series consoles already support 120Hz output system-wide. What this actually means is that with 120Hz output turned on in the system settings and toggled on in-game, Dragon's Dogma can go above 60 FPS in very limited circumstances, like when looking up at the sky with ray tracing turned off. Low framerate compensation works whether 120Hz is toggled on in-game or not. Any other visual or performance metrics seemed identical to me across the two patches. I'd still strongly recommend playing the game on a VRR panel at 120Hz to ensure the best visual outcomes, as VRR plus low framerate compensation cleans up the game's frame times reasonably well. That's the only way to get consistently good frame times out of Dragon's Dogma 2 on Series X, except in Vernworth, where inconsistencies are evident even with VRR. The PS5 code looks a lot like it did before in terms of visual settings, but there is one very noticeable change. With ray tracing turned off, the ambient occlusion on PS5 appeared quite restrained in patch 2 relative to Series X. As of the latest patch though, the two consoles have a very similar AO presentation. I think this is for the best, as the AO on PS5 now provides richer indirect shading, and looks closer to the game with ray tracing turned on. The PS5 proves a very close match overall for the Series X release, as of patch 7. The only big difference stems from the Xbox's checkerboarding issues we discussed earlier. In performance terms, the PS5 performs essentially identically in patch 2 and patch 7 when the game is GPU bound, but in Vernworth, we again see a performance uplift in patch 7 when we do a loop around the city walls. It's not an earth-shattering difference, but the new patch is running consistently ahead of patch 2. The X is still ahead of PS5 in GPU-bound scenarios, like in these idle shots where the Series X is about 10% faster. But interestingly, our Vernworth run produces noticeably elevated frame rates on Sony's console, at 4.9% faster throughout a run of the city with ray tracing enabled. The difference isn't gigantic, but the PS5 does run quicker in these shots. Unfortunately, the 30 FPS frame pacing issues return on Sony's console, just like on Series X. The game suffers from periods of incorrectly paced frames, even when the game itself averages a straight 30 FPS. The key performance tweak on PS5 doesn't have anything to do with the game's actual frame rates though. Previously, Dragon's Dogma 2 only ran at 60Hz on PS5, which meant that any time it dropped below 48Hz, on a VRR-enabled display, frame delivery would no longer be smoothed by VRR. Now Dragon's Dogma 2 can run at 120Hz with low framerate compensation if you enable 120Hz in the system settings and toggle 120Hz on in the game settings. This means you can get the same smooth frame delivery that has been possible on the Xbox Series machines since launch. It doesn't magically make the game run faster, but it does smooth out the frame delivery to the point where Dragon's Dogma 2 feels and looks pretty consistent, whether you cap the game to 30 FPS or leave it uncapped. Like on Series X, the game can also run above 60 FPS with these options enabled. Lastly, we need to take a crack at the Series S. The same AO tweak we saw on PS5 is now present here, so the ambient occlusion is a lot richer than in the prior patch, providing more extensive coverage in indirectly lit areas. It's a welcome change for sure. The game's checkerboard resolve has also been altered in line with Series X. The texture detail in this shot appears a bit softer now, but the artifacts are gone. It's an improvement on the whole, though I still think image quality could be further enhanced. Other visual settings appear identical to patch 2. The Series S still struggles with lighting quality overall. RTGI still isn't available, and shadows are very low resolution and flicker constantly in outdoor scenes. Essentially, both the game's indirect lighting and direct lighting take a big hit on the S relative to the maxed out PS5 and Series X experience. Performance-wise, patch 2 and patch 7 hit a nearly identical performance level in GPU-bound shots. Our CPU-bound Vernworth run tracks closely with the Series X, just at a slightly lower performance level. This is about what you'd expect given the lower CPU clocks on Series S. 120Hz can be enabled as a toggle in the game settings here as well, which presumably unlocks the frame rate, though I couldn't find any areas where the game actually managed to exceed 60 FPS. I hate to be a broken record here, but frame pacing does continue to be an issue on Series S in the most recent patch, in common with the other consoles. I think Dragon's Dogma has had a reasonably successful patching cycle since patch 2. Back in April, I identified 7 key issues where the game still needed improvement. Of these problems, 5 have been fixed to some degree or another, some partially addressed, with others completely resolved. I think the game is in quite good form now relative to patch 2, and especially relative to the launch code. The game's 3 key flaws, poor CPU-bound performance, broken reconstruction on the Xbox consoles, and no proper 120Hz VRR output on PS5 have all been addressed at least partially. Flaws on console are a lot less glaring than they were before. In terms of the console face-off, I'd say the results at the moment are fairly equivocal. Both PS5 and Series X pull off a rich RTGI-infused presentation, and both can achieve decent frame delivery if you combine 120Hz output with VRR. In performance terms, it's just about a draw, with the PS5 faster in cities and the Series X quicker everywhere else. The Series X continues to suffer from some more minor reconstruction issues, though that do make the game appear less sharp, so I'd probably shade in the direction of favoring the PS5 release at the moment. Series S offers a less flattering rendition of the game's lighting and is a clear step down, though at least ambient occlusion is presenting properly on the console now. My primary remaining concerns come down to performance. The game's 30 FPS cap is still sort of broken, exhibiting poor frame pacing with frequent inconsistencies, and I would like to see a proper 60 FPS targeting mode, perhaps cutting back resolution to try to hit 60 FPS. Capcom's general approach of targeting unlocked frame rates isn't my favorite admittedly, but at least they give more advanced users enough configurability to get frame delivery under control. So Dragon's Dogma 2 is a noticeably improved experience as of patch 7. That assessment isn't without caveats, but I'm pleased by the progress that's been made so far. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.